Sustainability is a word that's been co-opted by traditional, not traditional, but conventional agriculture. Is it already gone?
Hmm?
Okay. So sustainability used to mean that you could continue to grow food on the same piece of land over and over again, which was basically the concept of a family farm, right? You had a farm that you could pass on to your kids, who passed it on to their kids.
Mm-hmm.
So you practiced methods and techniques that were passed on in a culturally intact world. One family learned something, and then they learn a little bit more, and they learn a little bit more. And if it's a sustainable system, they're able to pass it on. And so what sustainable agriculture was in this country turned unsustainable as people started to want to make profit, okay? And it became more and more difficult to compete. The competition usually occurred from foreign sources of food. So as we went global, basically, it became more and more difficult to compete in a sustainable way, which meant that you had to extract more and more resources from your land than the land could support.
To compete, yeah.
To maintain itself. And basically, farming the concept of farming, when it works, is we're partners with nature in doing this. And the profit comes, in a sustainable system, the profit comes from the work that nature does. So nature is putting out the sun, putting out the water, has the minerals in the ground, the bacteria in the ground are fixing nitrogen out of the air. It was just a sustainable system, meaning that the next year either would be better or at least you could pull it off again.
Mm-hmm.
But sustainable now means that you make enough money to pay the bills.
Right.
Okay. The way we pay our bills is we usually borrow money. Most farmers are in debt at the beginning of the season. They have to borrow money to pay for their fertilizer. They have to borrow money to pay for their seeds, because now they can't make their seeds every year because now seeds are GMO or hybrids that don't produce viable seed. And this didn't happen overnight. The real revolution began in the 50s with the introduction of really cheap ammonium nitrate fertilizer. Farmers are miners of minerals, and in a natural system, the minerals replenish every year, and they mine the minerals, and they have plants that mine the minerals effectively, and that's basically what they're doing. But with the introduction of chemical fertilizers, the chemical fertilizers actually were more efficient at mining the minerals. They were in acid form, they made them, and the plants grew more, and with more plants, farmers were able to compete, so therefore they got less per bushel, but they were able to grow more bushels, and therefore be able to pay off their debts at the end of the season. And the system worked fairly well, but as these minerals were exploited unnaturally by the chemicals, the chemical nitrogen and the chemical phosphate, the phosphates that were basically aciduated and they turned acidified, and so they become a little bit more available because in this system, in this acid type farming, the phosphates became unavailable, so they had to bring in unnatural phosphates because the phosphates would get tied up with the aluminum molecule and they become aluminum phosphate in the ground. So they would have enough phosphorus, but it wouldn't be available. And the same happened in this system. Slowly minerals started getting tied up. Iron became complex, wasn't available, and other minerals didn't get complex. So they had to use more and more chemical fertilizer to get these things into solution. This happened just super gradually as farmers abandoned sustainable practices. So sustainable practices meant that you grew your own nitrogen, one way or the other. Okay, meaning you either planted legumes that fix nitrogen, or other kinds of where you utilized your grassland that was on your farm and had cattle, and then you used the cattle manure to use as your fertilizer. But then with the introduction of synthetic nitrogen, basically nitrogen created which was a process that actually created bomb-grade material, created ammonium nitrate. In a natural system, plants basically grow their own pesticides, they grow their own protection from the sun, they grow their own fungicides, basically, by attracting different kinds of bacterias and funguses, mycorrhizal bacterias and mycorrhizal fungi and stuff like that. And they created chemicals, pesticides, fungicides, and other things to basically protect the plants that were now used to be protected by Mother Nature. As these chemicals were used more and more to get to get things to actually grow, the things that created the phytonutrients, the trace elements, the things that were parts per million or parts, 100 parts per million or 5 parts per million or something like that, they began to disappear. The grosser chemicals, the grosser minerals were still there, but the weakest links became these parts per million things that went into solution too quickly and were disappeared. These were the chemicals that created the proteins, that created the phytochemicals that protected the plants from insects and funguses. So with the introduction of hybrids that were able to grow in demineralized conditions, which is why hybrids were developed, they weren't developed to increase yields. If they wanted to increase yields, they could have just remineralized the farmland. Hybrids were really invented basically to grow in the demineralized conditions so the investment wouldn't have to be made into mineralization. They could maintain just with their chemical fertilizers. And also hybrids gave these chemical companies, who were basically the seed manufacturers, a little more control over what was being grown. Gave the seed companies a lot more power because the farmers weren't able to produce their own seed every year. The farmers had to get bigger and bigger and bigger, which meant less and less farmers. Maybe they made a little bit more money, but only the guys who got big and big and big and bigger made a little bit more money. All the little guys slowly started getting abandoned because all of the investments that were once the Extension Service and the federal government in the 40s and 50s that basically protected small farmers, all of those investments went into equipment, chemicals, techniques for large-scale farming. And with the introduction of student loans in the 50s, which was the GI Bill started it with loans to the servicemen, right, to go to college. With the introduction, they basically took this population now that wasn't growing food because their families were kicked off the farm, and they sent them all to colleges. And they created this bubble, this college bubble, and basically slowly depopulated the rural areas because as these farmers were consolidated, there were less and less farmers. So they started moving into cities. We now live in a society where everybody is completely dependent upon somebody else to survive. Meaning they have to go to the store to buy food, or they have to go to the doctor to stay healthy, or they need pills every day to get through the day. The aspartame, the monosodium glutamate, all the things that are added to food to make them look a little bit more attractive and edible, or a lot of them are very addictive. We have serious problems coming now because now we have to feed all these people in the city. Nobody knows how to grow their own food. When the Depression came in the 30s, half the country, close to half the country was on farm, and still 10 million people starved to death. Mm-hmm. Now we have, 30, 40, 50 million people on food stamps? I mean, is this a depression? We don't have the intact culture anymore. We don't have a father teaching a son how to farm sustainably. We don't have that. And so it's almost virtually impossible to get back to the dream that, let's say, I have and people that live this type of lifestyle have, because there isn't that warehouse, that storehouse of knowledge and experience. There isn't the fertility anymore in this country. Every time someone talks about sustainable farming, usually they're lying if they're in power, because it's all about land banking. It's all about controlling the land, keeping people off the land. Basically states and large landholders want to lease the land to farmers. And because they're using the farmers basically to pay the property taxes for the next 20, 30 years, because in the hope that the landowner will sometime be able to develop, maybe build a Costco or a housing development or condos, or here in Hawaii, a hotel or something like that. And so they're basically using the farmers, and it's called land banking. They're basically loaning the land to the farmer with a lease, because down the line they want to develop it. Now what happens in that kind of a system, a farmer that comes along and is leasing land isn't going to remineralize, isn't going to make it nicer. It's going to turn into a total dump. Most of the land here that's available for leases are garbage pits, literally, with irrigation and plastic, and because here in Hawaii, conventional farmers will cover acres in plastic and then spike chemicals into it and totally kill everything that's in the soil, then plant the plants and use chemical fertilizers,
so hydroponically,
yeah, basically. And most of that fertilizer goes into the nearshore environment. It's very polluting. We've seen a real change here in Hawaii. Millions of tons of topsoil are gone. Fertile land doesn't exist anymore. Most of the land in Hawaii that was farmed conventionally by the sugarcane companies and even these guys growing coffee over here are really nothing more than toxic waste dumps now. And if we look at every major revolution that's ever happened, it's been about land reform, which basically means putting people on the land to grow their food and survive. Someone talks about sustainable ag and talks about putting people back on the land, giving, not leasing them land for 10 years, but saying, here, this is your piece of land now, love it, and let's create a new family farm system. I'll believe them.